my name's David. I'm going to go ahead and help you with the bones. I heard, I guess you have an anatomy and physiology class that you're studying for. And I'm going to try to get as much detail in as I can while trying to remain concise. So it's going to be a little bit tricky, but hopefully we can get through this together. So you can separate, for the most part, the skeleton into the appendicular part and the axial part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to isolate the axial portion of the skeleton, and we'll go through that. And then afterwards, what we'll do is we'll do the appendicular skeleton. What I'm going to go ahead and isolate that right now then. Let's see. And just in case you're interested in this program, this program's called Essential Anatomy. I just got it off of the App Store, the Apple App Store, and it definitely helped. It didn't help me so much with the bones as much as it did muscles, but I mean, it's a fantastic program. But okay, let's go ahead and hide that. The first thing that we're going to look at is the spinal column. Okay, so this first vertebrae, it's C1, and it's also called the atlas. And the atlas and the dens, the axis right over here are actually pretty unique. It has the axis has this structure over here called the dens that kind of fits pretty snugly over here into C1, the atlas. Okay, so C means cervical, referring to the neck, and 1 is obviously the first one in line. So we have C1, which is atlas, C2, which has that dens that's poking up right over here, C3, C4, C5, C6, and C7. Okay, so distinct features about cervical vertebrae. Let me go ahead and isolate one right over here. You can see there is a pretty small body, and the unique thing about them is that they have these transverse foramen. So you have thoracic vertebrae and lumbar vertebrae and cervical vertebrae. But again, distinct feature, you have transverse foramen. Foramen just means hole. What passes through here is, for example, you have some nerves and also the vertebral artery. Okay, and this hole right over here is called the vertebral foramen. Okay, and this part over here that's sticking out, this is just a spinous process. Okay, but again, main distinct feature is going to be that transverse foramen. We're going to go ahead and move on to the thoracic vertebrae. Okay, so we actually have 12 of those. Anytime you hear thoracic, just think of the ribs as far as the vertebrae go, because any of the thoracic vertebrae are always attached to ribs in a healthy human being. Okay, so again, we have 12 of them because we have 12 ribs on each side, so a total of 24. Let's go ahead and go through unique morphological features of thoracic vertebrae. So I'll go ahead and isolate this guy right over here. Compared to the cervical vertebrae, you can see that this one actually has a larger body, but the main thing that you want to take away is that this has costal facets. So facets are just flattened portions, and the reason that they have that is, if I unisolate it again, it's where the ribs meet the vertebrae. Okay, so you tend to have facets or smooth parts where bones meeting other bone. So let me isolate this again, because there's this neat trick that I learned to be able to identify these pretty easily. If you take a thoracic vertebrae and you look at it like this, it almost kind of looks like a giraffe. You know how it has those horn things over here at the top? And I guess these would be the ears, right? You can see the snout would be this portion right over here. So I thought that was always neat and pretty fun. It made lab practicals pretty easy because you could spot them really quickly. Okay, so again, we have 12 of those, 12 thoracic vertebrae. Let me actually go to that top one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and then 12. So you know that I'm not lying. Okay, and as I mentioned before, we also have a lumbar vertebrae. So that's going to be starting with this guy right over here. We have 5 lumbar vertebrae. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what you're going to notice about these guys is that they actually have quite a large body. And it makes sense because if it's on the bottom, it's going to be bearing more weight. So we want that portion to be thicker to be able to support that weight. This doesn't have flattened portions right over here because they do not attach to ribs. Okay, but other than just kind of staring at it, I don't have the sort of giraffe thing for this. but yeah, you can definitely tell because it doesn't have those costal facets. That's going to be one of the defining features for the lumbar vertebrae. So we'll go ahead and move down over here. This over here is called the sacrum. Let me go ahead and isolate that. So the sacrum's pretty interesting, and the reason is it's because it's actually a series of 5 fused vertebrae, and they're numbered as well. So this is called S1, S2 over here, S3, S4, and then this last portion right over here is called S5. And you'll see that it has these foramen right over here as well. So foramina is actually the plural of a foramen. So these right over here are actually called the, we're looking at the front side. So this is anterior. This is the anterior sacral foramina. Okay. And this would just be the base of the sacrum. These right over here, these kind of pokey outy bits, any pokey outy bits are typically called processes. So this is the superior articular process. Okay. And you'll also notice the distinction between the fused vertebrae are these transverse lines, and that's what we call them. They're just called transverse lines. Okay. So you'll also notice kind of where we saw the spinous processes on the spinal column, you have these pokey outy bits right over here, but that's actually called the median sacral crest, and then you have the sort of it kind of bulges out over here on each side as well, and since it's off to the side, we just call it the lateral sacral crest. Okay, so I think we're done with the sacrum. Let's go ahead and move down to the coccyx. Okay, so the coccyx is just this part right over here. We'll go ahead and zoom in on it. So what we have here is this pokey outy bit we call a transverse process. Okay, and this actually just ends up being few fused vertebrae as well. So this is typically 3 to 5 in mammals. Okay. So I think that's it with the spinal column. If we look at it more macroscopically, you'll notice that there are certain curves to it. So it's not just a straight curve, and there's a good reason why we have this. It helps with our posture, because we are orthograde animals, and orthograde is a little bit different from bipedal. So orthograde refers to our posture, whereas bipedal refers to motion. So bipedal, you're using 2 feet to walk, and orthograde is just standing upright. So there's a bit of a distinction there, but let's go to our curves. We have a quaternary curved spine, so you have one curve here, another curve here, another one right here, and then the final one is at the sacrum. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and shift gears and look at this part of the axial skeleton. So this is actually called the manubrium of the sternum. This is the body of the sternum, and this is the xiphoid process of the sternum. And all of these pieces make up, you guessed it, the sternum. And so this is a very important part. Of course, if you take away anything from anatomy and physiology, just form follows function. So there's a very good reason why things are where they are and why they're shaped why they are. This is going to be protecting a lot of the internal organs that you're going to have, so you want something with a formidable amount of strength there. So that's why this bone tends to be very hard, and it actually provides a lot of protection for those internal organs inside the thoracic cavity. Okay. So you also have, because we don't have the appendicular skeleton, you can't see the clavicle. I'll go ahead and add in the appendicular skeleton now, since we're done with most of what we're going to look at for the axial skeleton. And I think I mentioned earlier, we're going to look at the skull a little bit later because it tends to be pretty complicated. So let's turn that on. Yeah, okay. So if we look at the manubrium, it has these flattened portions right over here. We'll call those the clavicular facets because they're the flattened bit that the clavicle attaches to. So these over here are going to be, this is the right clavicle and this is the left clavicle. And actually that brings up a really good point. So this right over here is the humerus, but if you want to be technical, that wouldn't be necessarily the correct answer because it's the right humerus. You can't interchange the two because if you did, it would look kind of funky. So just remember, if you want to be technically correct, if somebody asks you, hey, what's that bone? Well, that's going to be the right humerus, and the other one's going to be the left. Okay, sorry, getting too excited about anatomy. We have the body of the sternum over here, and then the xiphoid process. Interesting fact about the xiphoid process is actually one of the last bones that ossify, so becomes calcified in the adult human body. So because I'm egotistical and I'm a male, I know 25 is about the age that actually becomes ossified. Yeah, I'm not sure for females exactly. But, okay, so we've covered most of the axial skeleton there. We also have the ribs. Okay, so the ribs are actually pretty simple. There are 12 of them. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then the last two are pretty interesting. They're called floating ribs because they don't have any direct connection to the sternum. But if I go ahead and turn on the connective tissue right over here, you can see that that the other ones do have a direct connection to the sternum. Well, not necessarily direct because these ribs right over here kind of hitch a ride on the other ones. But what I also want to show you about the ribs is that you have true ribs and false ribs. With true ribs, you have one connection of a cartilage. This is going to be cartilage right over here that connects your rib to the sternum. So if we go ahead and count which ribs those are, we'll know how many false true ribs we have and how many false ribs. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ribs that are true ribs, and then we'll go ahead and, or excuse me, this actually makes a direct connection and only requires 1, so that's actually 7 true ribs, so 6, and then 7 true ribs. We have 3 false ribs, and that will be because you need this connection right over here to get all the way up here. Okay, so it kind of requires 2 connections to get up to the sternum. All right, so that's gonna be your ribs. And we'll go ahead and move on to the clavicles. They're a really pretty bone, but pretty uninteresting in the sense that they don't have very many crazy anatomical features. And if you wanted more detail on it, I'm absolutely sure that it would be pretty easy to find, but it's not a very spectacular bone. But one that definitely is the scapula. Okay, so that's typically referred to as the shoulder blade. So yeah, we're getting into the appendicular skeleton right now. And I'm going to go ahead and isolate the left scapula right over here. And it's a really interesting bone. It's got quite a few processes, and there's a very good reason why they're there. You actually have a lot of muscles that attach there for a lot of your arm movement, shoulder movement, and overall just stability and protection of your back, correct? So if we'll go ahead and look at this bone right over here, you'll see that you have these two processes right over here. So, or let me start right over here because it's actually a little bit easier to look at, because you can use the spine as your marker. The spine, you'll probably guess, is this part right over here. And the spine separates the supraspinous fossa from the infraspinous fossa. So this part is flattened out, so we call it a fossa. This is the medial vertebral border, inferior angle right over here, the lateral border, excuse me, and yeah, let's get to these two processes right over here now that we're sort of oriented. This is the acromion process, and this right over here is the coracoid process. Okay, so that's going to be points of muscle attachment. This over here is the superior border, so this is towards the head. Anything superior is usually up cranially versus inferior. So that's the superior angle that we have over here. I'm not done with this bone yet. And this flattened portion right over here, that's where the humerus is actually going to attach. So if we can take out the connective tissue and see that border, the humerus right over here, and then where where it meets the scapula, that part is called the glenoid fossa. So this part right over here, glenoid fossa, or yeah, you can also call it the cavity. Okay, I think we've got most of everything on the scapula. This right over here, this is called the neck. So you have the spine and then the neck right over here of the scapula. Okay, so I think we've gone through enough detail on that one. Or actually, well, I'm looking at it this way because we mostly saw it from the other side. This right over here is below the scapula, because if you kind of look at it when it's not isolated, it faces inferiorly. That's called the subscapular fossa. So sub meaning below, and then scapular fossa. Scapula obviously referring to scapula, and then you have a flattened portion. So subscapular fossa is right over here. And okay, now I think we're good. Okay, so let's go ahead and move down to the arms right over here. So the big bone right over here is called the humerus. It's actually the longest of the pectoral limb bones and one of the heaviest as well. This articular head right over here, so this is the head of the humerus, is actually going to fit into that glenoid fossa that we were looking at earlier. Okay, and you can see this sort of a bumpy bit right over here. This is called the lesser tubercle. Okay, or I'm sorry, that's not the lesser tubercle. The smaller one's the lesser tubercle, which is this right over here. Sorry about that. This is the greater tubercle. So it's just basically going to be a rough, bumpy bit. So we have that. This is the neck. So if this is the head of the humerus, then this over here is going to be the neck. You're going to see this line over here that kind of separates the lesser and the greater tubercle. That's just called the intertubercular groove, excuse me. Okay, so I think that's most of the features of that top part of the humerus. We'll go ahead and look at the anterior view of the humerus. So anterior, that's going to be kind of like as opposed to posterior. If we look at the anterior side, you'll see that there's this hole. This hole over here that's called the coronoid fossa. Okay, and then right next to it, it's a little bit smaller. There's a little bit of an elongated impression, and that's called the radial fossa. And the reason that it's called the radial fossa is because that's where, if you bend the arm, that's where the radius is going to kind of fit into. That's going to be, it's going to be this guy right over here. All right. So we have the humerus, the coronoid fossa, as well as the radial fossa. You'll also notice that this right over here is a little bit rounded. And what we call this is the capitulum. So the capitulum is actually where the head of the radius kind of goes into the humerus. This other side is called the trochlea. So that's the site where the ulna is going to meet the humerus. So that's going to be, if I get rid of, or no, I won't get rid of them because I want to see them later. Okay, so this pointy bit right over here is called the trochlea. All right, and this right over here is called the medial epicondyle. We'll go ahead and move on to the radius and the ulna. Okay, so the radius is always going to be on the side with the thumb. Okay, so I just think Teddy Roosevelt's one of my favorite presidents, so it's kind of easy for me to remember. TR is going to be the radius and the thumb, so always on the thumb side. And then you have the ulna right over here, so that's going to be up, ulna, pinky. And a few of the features, we'll start with the ulna. We have the coronoid process right over here. Okay. We have the olecranon process. And what you're going to notice more if you see it on an actual model than you can see on the computer model is you're going to have a crest right over here. And because it's between two bones, it's just called the interosseous crests. This over here is the head of the ulna, right over here. And if I kind of turn it onto this side, you'll see a pokey outy bit right over here. That's called the styloid process. One of my friends in anatomy said, oh, well, you know, when you're doing the Z-snap, you really want to get your wrist into it, so you kind of attributed that to the ulna. Yeah, we used terrible mnemonic devices. Okay, let me go ahead and isolate the radius right over here. The radius is really cool, and if I have it in a practical, I can tell it apart really easily because if I look at the head of it, it's almost a perfect circle. And you think of radius, you always think of a circle. So that's pretty easy to look at, if you ask me. You have a bumpy bit right over here that's called the radial tuberosity. And if you have a head of the radius, then you also have the neck. So this portion is going to be the neck, and the radius also, thankfully, has a styloid process, which is going to be right over here. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the hand. There we go. So the hand is really interesting along with the wrist. We have go ahead and hide that. Okay, we have quite a few bones right over here. They're called the carpals, and that's going to be the wrist bones. You have a total of 8 of them, and we're going to go ahead and start. Where is it? There you are with the scaphoid, and we're going to go around. So the scaphoid, if you isolate it, and especially on a model, it kind of looks like a twisted S. Yeah, maybe not so much on here, but if you play with it, you'll end up being able to kind of tell the distinctions between each of the bones. But let's go ahead and go on. So we have the scaphoid, and then we have trapezium. Okay, trapezium. If you're on a trapeze, then sometimes you might see crazy people on a bike that's on a trapeze, and it kind of looks like a bike seat if you spend enough time with it. And then we have a trapezoid right over here. Somehow, I guess anatomists thought it kind of looked like a trapezoid, which I don't really see it, but I'll go ahead and isolate it for you. Okay, so you have trapezoid, and then you have a big one right over here that's called capitate. And this one, if you look on a model, it almost looks like a head. There's a rounded bit. There's a rounded bit, and it kind of attenuates at some point. So that's how you can tell capitate, because decapitate, right? Like, oh, you don't want that to happen. But I mean, it's a good mnemonic device. We have hamate. Hamate has this little projection right over here, and it has this pointy bit, and it kind of reminds me of a hammer, so I call that hamate, and a lot of anatomists like to call it hamate too. Next we have a triquetral, or triquetral. This one, you just have to spend some time with it. It kind of reminds me of a trapezium, but the fact of life is it's going to be pretty hard to tell those apart, but if you spend enough time with it, then you'll kind of get used to it. Pisiform is going to be like a P, so P for pisiform. Not shaped like the letter P, but like, you know, the food P. Okay, so we have these right over here. These are called the metacarpals. Okay, so we have 5 of them. That's pretty easy. They're numbered 1 through 5, starting at the thumb. Then you have the phalanges. So you have 3 phalanges for your fingers. You have a proximal, so it's actually that's going to be starting right over here. Proximal phalange for the thumb, and then for the index finger, middle finger, ring finger, and then your pinky. So that's a proximal phalange. The thumb actually is going to just have a distal phalange, whereas the rest of these are going to have a middle. Okay, so just remember there's no middle for the thumb, and you can see if you look at your hands the difference there. you have the middle, or I guess they call it intermediate here, whichever should suffice. And you're going to have 4 of those for each of your other fingers. The last one, you probably guessed it, is going to be distal. So distal phalange or phalanx. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. So again, like I said, each of the bones are unique on the right and left side, but I think if you practice enough with this video, then you'll be able to transfer it onto the other side. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and look at the quote-unquote pelvis. And I say quote-unquote because we don't really call this the pelvis in anatomy as much as we like to call it other things. So this bowl-shaped thing right over here we call the os coxa. So we have 6 bones in total that make up our one os coxa, and those are going to be 3 on each side. So this right over here, really pretty, is called the ilium, the left ilium, and then this, what we kind of sit on right over here, is called the ischium. And then this is the pubis. Okay, so they're all fused together, but they have separate anatomical features, and that's why we separate them in this way. Let me go ahead and get rid of this femur right over here. This is actually a pretty important feature of the pelvis because that's where the head of the femur goes in. We call that the acetabulum. And there are a bunch of features on the pelvis, and I can go through some of them, hopefully most of them with you, but just to show you the distinction between the ilium, ischium, and the pubis right now, you can kind of separate it in this way. So everything that's bounded up by this region, so all of this is going to be the ilium. Everything on this side is going to be the ischium, and this is all going to be the pubis. So same for the other side. Let's go ahead and see what features that we can find on here. Hopefully I get enough detail in for you. This over here is going to be called the iliac crest. Okay. We also have, let me see what else we have right over here. We have, okay, this part right over here. This notch right over here, that's called the greater sciatic notch. All right, so we have a greater one, and then we also have a lesser one right over here. And what separates that is this right over here, that's called the ischial spine. And there's a roughened bit that's right next to it, right over here, that's called the ischial tuberosity. You'll notice, if you haven't already, there's this very large foramen in our os coxa, and that's called the the obturator foramen, and that's because the obturator nerve passes through there, and then so that's actually what it's named after. And if I put some connective tissue on here, you actually have this that's called the sorry, it's kind of like hard to say for me, the obturator membrane. Okay, so we have that there, and that's going to be most of the major features. You also have these branches right over here. This is called the ramus. So if you know any Spanish, branch in Spanish is rama. So this is right next to, so if we look at it on this side, this is right on our ischium. So we just call it the ramus of the ischium. And then on the other side, we have the inferior inferior ramus of the pubis, and you also have the superior ramus. Okay. Any other features? If you see something and you want to know more about it, then I absolutely encourage you to message me afterwards, and maybe I can provide some more clarification, but I just want to make sure that I get to probably most of what you need for your class. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to the femur right over here. So I'm going to go ahead and keep it as it is, sort of, so we sort of know how it's oriented. We have the head of the femur that goes into that acetabulum. If we have a head, then we also have a neck. I really like the femur too. It's the longest bone in the body. And the cool thing about it is that it's actually a site for, as a lot of bone marrow, that's a site for hematopoiesis, so generation of new red blood cells. So that's pretty cool. We have this large process right over here. This is called the greater trochanter. This is called the lesser trochanter. Okay, they're on opposite sides. The lesser trochanter is more medial. The greater trochanter is more lateral. And you'll also notice that there's this line right over here that many muscles actually attach into. This is called the linea aspera. And while we're looking at the posterior side, you'll notice these two bumps right over here. These are called the condyles. So this is on the lateral side, so we call that the lateral condyle, and this is medial, so that's medial condyle. We also have this this flattened bit that kind of, it looks like a valley in between them. That's called the intercondylar fossa. So we have condyles on each side, it's just intercondylar. And we also have, if we'll go ahead and look at this side, there's gonna be a flattened bit where the patella, the kneecap, kind of goes into. So we also have the patella right over here, and that's connected by a lot of connective tissue. So let me turn on the connective tissue. See, there's a great padding of connective tissue that kind of keeps it situated on there. But I think that's most of the major features of our femur. We can go ahead and move on to our tibia and our fibula. Let's complete our guy. Okay, so we're looking at our anterior view. I'll go ahead and look at the tibia right over here. So like the femur had condyles, this one also has condyles. This one has a lateral. On the lateral side, we have the lateral epicondyle. We have the medial epicondyle, and let me go ahead and isolate this bone because I want you to see a pretty distinct feature of the tibia. If we look at it on this side, there's a pochiality bit right over here. Instead of a process, we actually call this an eminence. So this is in between the condyles, called the intercondylar eminence. And it's got quite a prominent rough patch right over here. This is called the tibial tuberosity. You'll also notice that there's a line right over here, and the line forms a crest. So it's on the anterior side. We call it the anterior crest. And while we're looking over here at lines, you can't really see on this model so well, but trust me, it's there. There's this line right over here called the soleal line. And just like we saw on the radius and the ulna, there's an interosseous crest on each of these bones, the fibula and the tibia. And another cool thing to note about these guys is that the tibia is homologous to the radius, and the ulna is homologous to the fibula. So we'll go ahead and move down to this side of the tibia. You have this this part that kind of sticks out. It's called the malleolus, and because it's on the medial side, we call it the medial malleolus. We have one on the other side too, on the fibula, and that one's called the lateral malleolus. So actually, that was a pretty nice transition into the fibula. It's quite a skinny bone because we don't usually use it to bear that much weight. The tibia will typically do that. But let's go ahead and take a look at it. The fibula also has an anterior crest. It has a head, and it also has this neck portion right over here. But other than that, there aren't too many hugely defining features for the fibula, but we're going to go ahead and move on to the feet. Let's go ahead and take away these guys. And the feet are quite intricate, but everything fits really nicely together. So that's a really neat thing about it. So, whoa, what am I doing? Okay, there we go. So this big bone right over here is called the calcaneus. All right, so these are homologous to the carpals. These are all the tarsals. So we'll look at this over here is the calcaneus. This right over here is actually the talus. Okay, so the talus, and then you have the calcaneus. Let me go ahead and isolate him so you can take a look at him. Okay, so this kind of forms our heel. The talus, go ahead and isolate that one. Okay, when you look at a model, the reason that it's named the talus is because it kind of looks like a talon, where these parts project and almost look like a claw, so that's where it gets its name. This bone right over here is actually kind of cool because it's called the navicular, and it kind of looks like, okay, really roughly like a boat, right? So as this part right over here, so navy, kind of think boat right there. These bones right over here, the rest of them end up not being too bad. This over here is the cuboid, and you can kind of see that it is shaped very roughly like a cube. And the rest are pretty easy. You have lateral cuneiform. So this is our pinky right over here. It's the most lateral of the cuneiforms. You have the intermediate or medial. You have the intermediate one, and you also have the medial cuneiform. The intermediate is going to be the smallest, medial biggest, and then the lateral cuneiform is going to be somewhere in the middle. Just like we saw on the hand, just like we saw on the hand, we also have metatarsals. So we have 5 of them, starting at our first digit, so our big toe, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And just like our hands, we also have a proximal and distal phalanx for the big toe. And we have a proximal, medial, or intermediate, and also a distal phalanx for the rest of our toes. Okay, so that would be the completion of our feet right there. So I believe we've gone through everything except for the skull. The skull is pretty complicated, but we'll get rid of some of the flat bones and go into the more intricate pieces. Okay, so this right over here, pretty easy, is the frontal bone. I'll go ahead and isolate that so you can take a look at it. It has the brow ridge right over here. But because it has that, that's going to be pretty telling if you have to identify a disarticulated skull. On the sides, right over here, you have the parietal bones. Okay. On the back, you have the occipital. This right over here is called the temporal bone. And this is the mandible. Many anatomy books are starting to call this the dentary, but either is acceptable. And I'll go ahead and isolate it because it's actually a really cool bone as well. And we can look at several features on it as well. So this right over here is a hole, so we call that a foramen. That's the mental foramen. And then we also have other features of it as well. Let me go ahead and check that right now. Okay, yeah. So other features of the mandible, we also have, so this right over here is considered the body. This is the mandibular notch, coronoid process, and condylar process. Okay. And you'll see there's also a hole right over here. That's called the mandibular foramen. This, where the teeth kind of go into, we call that the alveolar margin. And this part right over here that kind of sticks out, that's the mental protuberance. All right, so we have the bottom part of our mouth. Let's look at the top part. This is called the maxilla. This is one that's pretty telling as well because you have these features right over here where your teeth set into. So again, form follows function. So there's going to be those ridges that allow the teeth to set in. These bones right over here, right up above the nose, nasal bones. So we have our left and our right nasal bones. Pretty small. Let me go ahead and isolate it for you so you can take a look at it. And this bone right over here has a cool name. It's called the zygomatic bone. Okay, so that's where our prominent cheekbones come from. You have a small bone right over here called the lacrimal. So in Spanish, tears are called lagrima. So that's where the bone names come from, lacrimal. So that's around where the tear ducts are. We have, okay, so we looked at the temporal bone, but we didn't look at it with much detail, and I would be doing you an injustice if I didn't, because it's a really cool bone that has quite a few cool features on it. This is called the zygomatic portion, so if we look at it unisolated, it actually goes into the zygomatic, so that's why it's called the zygomatic portion. This is the squamous portion, so squamous refers to anything flat, so that's going to be the flat part of the bone. This part right over here, so the canal that goes towards the inner ear, that's called the external acoustic meatus. This right over here is a process. We call it the styloid process, and then this is the mastoid process. So that's right behind your ear. You can actually feel it if you touch back there. And I think that is most of our features. We also have this right over here, so let me unisolate it. That's where the mandible or the dentary sort of fits in. We call that the mandibular fossa. Okay. So that would be the major features of that bone. Let me go ahead and show you a few more things in the skull. This is actually one of my favorite bones. This one's called the sphenoid. It doesn't look like much from this angle, but there is quite a bit to it if I isolate it. Let me go to isolate this. So it kind of looks like a butterfly. So if you need to identify a disarticulated skull, look at this as a butterfly. You have greater wings right over here, and then you also have lesser wings. Okay. And you also have these portions right over here. They are sites of muscle attachment, so those are actually called the pterygoid wings. All right. And I think that is most of the features that we're going to look at this sphenoid. But again, if you wanted any more detail, please feel free to let me know. We have the ethmoid bone. I'll go ahead and isolate that. So this is actually the site where a lot of the mucosa is laid down, so it protects you from, if you breathe in a lot of debris, the mucosa, it sticks to it, and then you end up swallowing it, so it doesn't get to your lungs, so that's a good thing. Let me go ahead and get rid of this frontal, or no, not isolate it. Let me get rid of it. The ethmoid bone is actually superior to another bone. I'm going to need to hide some of these so you can see it. So this is the ethmoid right over here. You also have this bone right over here that's called the vomer. So the vomer, I'll go ahead and isolate it. It's quite a flat bone. That's just medial in the skull. All right. And it actually articulates with another bone called the palatine. So the palatine is actually part of the maxilla. So that's going to be where the roof of your mouth is. Okay. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that should be all of the bones of the skull. We also have one last bone, which is called the hyoid. Let me go ahead and isolate that. Okay. So this is between the mandible and the larynx, and it's right up around the C3 level of the vertebrae. It has these two horns. They're called the greater horns. And that would be actually one of the last bones that we are looking at. Let me go ahead and go to home and reset our skeleton right over here. I think we've covered all the bones, and if there's anything that I missed, anything that I can clarify, I would be absolutely happy to go ahead and help you with that. We also have the teeth right over here. Actually, if you wanted to take a look at those, I didn't really study these very much in my anatomy courses, but we can actually go ahead and look through that right now, just in case you needed it. We have our molars right over here, and then I think these are going to be premolars. Yes. Our premolars. And then next we have our canines, which is going to be used for tearing, right? We have our lateral and then our central incisors. So incisors are usually used for cutting. So cutting, tearing, and then molars are typically used for grinding, right? And I'm pretty sure I've covered most everything. Again, if there's anything you would like to see, then I would be happy to help you. But for now, I think we're covered with the anatomy portion of this lesson. Okay, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed it.